This morning we're going to look at two main texts, and we'll have a few other texts that we'll see for illustration. But we'll begin looking at John chapter 20, verse 19 through verse 21. And then later on in the sermon, we'll move to Psalms 121, verse 1 and through verse 3. When I was a child, I struggled with a lot of fears, especially at night. I don't know if it was growing up in a divorced home, not sure what it was, but at night I was always afraid when I'd go to bed. And so how I would deal with that fear is that I would pull the covers over my head and I would almost roll up like a big mummy. I'm not really sure why that would protect me. I guess it's sort of like a toddler when they go play hide and seek and they cover their eyes with their, as long as they can't see you, that means you can't see them. I'm not really sure, but for me, that under the covers was my hiding place. And when I was afraid, that was where I would go oftentimes at night. And as I grew up, I left many of the fears of my childhood, but then I moved on to new fears. And the truth is that all of us struggle with fears. And what I want us to talk about over the next several weeks is really dealing with those fears and really being the people that God really wants us to be, because all of us struggle with fears. And I want to think about, what are your worst fears? What is it that you are afraid of? Is it public failure? Are you afraid of becoming a failure in front of other people that others might see, and all of your weaknesses might be exposed to others? Are you afraid of unemployment? We live in a day where it seems like there are a lot of things as far as unemployment. Employment is sort of shaky, where we have major corporations here in town that for decades have been here to employ people, and now we see where many of those jobs are going away. Are you maybe afraid of heights? I'm afraid of heights. I don't mind a ladder, but on tall structures where somebody could possibly push me, I've always been deathly afraid of those kind of things. Maybe it's the fear of being rejected by others. Maybe for some of you, you're afraid of being abandoned. You're afraid that maybe you may be left, or maybe just simply forgotten. If you've struggled with fear, anxiety, or worry, again, don't miss this point. You're not alone. That fear is no respecter of persons. It strikes the weak and the powerful. It haunts the young and the old. It affects the rich and the poor. Fear even attacks those who seem to have it all together. Before we look at our main text this morning of John chapter 20, verse 19 through verse 21, I want you to get sort of a picture of what is going on here, because you've not really had the time to have gone through and read the context. But you may remember that the day that this happens is actually Easter Sunday or Resurrection Sunday, and so we think about where the disciples are at this moment. 3 days later, they had experienced the man that they had committed their lives to, the man that they had followed for 3.5 years, that the man that they had saw heal the sick and raise the dead and do all kind of miraculous things and rebuke the religious leaders and all those various things. They had watched this man die upon a cross for their sins and for our sins. They had watched him as he was put into a tomb, and the stone was rolled over the door of that tomb. And then 3 days later, as Peter and some of the other disciples went to the tomb, they found that the grave was empty. And here in John 20, we're not given a lot of detail about all the others, but we see where Mary Magdalene stays behind, and she's there at the empty grave, and she's missing her Lord, and she's wondering what has happened to his body. And about that time, Jesus speaks into her life and reminds her of his promises. And she returns back to the other disciples, and she tells them that she has seen the resurrected Christ and that he has spoken to her. So what do you think the response might be of the disciples that day? Would it be they would break out in party and song and dance, or have a great celebration service, or what might their response be? What we see here in John 20 is a different response than what we would expect from a resurrected Christ. Look with me at verses 19 through verse 21. It says, on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." We think about their response. We would expect them to break out in song and be willing to storm the temple gates to tell everybody about how their Messiah had been risen from the grave. But instead, we find them in an upper room hiding behind a locked door in fear of the Jews. And their fear was not caused by the fear of the crucifixion. Their fear was the fact that their Lord had been risen from the grave, And they knew that the religious leaders and the political leaders were going to be looking for who it was who had stolen the body. And they knew that they would be the first suspects, that would be his closest friends. And it was in this time of fear and anxiety that Jesus steps in the room and says to them twice, "Peace be with you." In the midst of their fear, their anxiety, their worry, Jesus speaks in their life and says, "Peace be with you." Listen, I don't know what any of you are going through or what may even be causing you to be filled with fear or anxiety, but this I do know. What you're searching for is peace, that peace that passes understanding. And I don't want you to miss this out of the text either. It's not a major point, but I don't want you to miss this in the text, that in the midst of their shame and their fear, Jesus didn't rebuke them, but instead he brought to them peace, and then he reminded them that they had a purpose and a mission for their lives. He spoke in their lives and said, "As a Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." Listen, let us be assured of this. God has given each of us an assignment. We know that ultimately that assignment is to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth, right? That is our overarching mission for all of us. But then within the context of that mission, all of us have specific parts that we are to play in fulfilling that mission as the church seeks to advance the kingdom of God. And I believe that that because of God's assignment for our life, that Satan is willing to use every tool at his disposal to keep us from fulfilling our God-given mission. And I believe that one of the most crippling tools that Satan uses in our lives is fear. Because fear erodes our faith, it steals our freedom, and it runs away with our hope. Fear causes us to obsess about our limitations. Fear keeps us from building friendships, and it can keep us from loving other people because we're afraid that we are going to be hurt by others. Fear keeps us from taking risk, from daring to do what God has created us to do. Listen, God has not called us to live in fear, but God has called us to be risk takers and to be willing to give everything that we have for the sake of the kingdom. But not only does fear keep us from taking risks, but fear also begins to erode our trust in God, and it eats away at our faith. And one of the most damaging effects of fear is that it keeps us from living the abundant life that Jesus has called for us to live. Matter of fact, that's exactly what Jesus said in John 10:10, right? The thief comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. But Jesus said, "I have come that you may have life and that you may have it abundantly." What is it that he wants to steal? Satan wants to steal your joy. He wants to steal your mission. He wants to steal your relationships. He wants to steal anything of value in your life that has eternalness in its value. And so our fear keeps us from being all that God would want us to be. And I believe that's one of the reasons why Jesus gave us the command to not be afraid 15 times in the four Gospels. Matter of fact, if you go back and you read through the four Gospels, the command that Jesus gives the most always has to do with fear. That's the number one command. Do not be afraid. Be strong and courageous. Over and over again, he gives these commands. More than any other command is to not be afraid, because he understood that if we are consumed with fear, then we'll never be all that God has called us to be. And so our focus over the next few weeks is not how to fear less, but how do we trust God more? Because fear is an absence of faith. And so what needs to happen to drive out fear is that our faith must increase, that we must trust him even more. So how do we trust God more? I want us to look now at Psalms 121, verse 1 through verse 3. Psalms 121, verse 1 through verse 3. The psalmist says, "I lift up my eyes to the hills, for where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth." He says, "He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber." So we think about the question, how do we trust God more? If fear is an absence of faith, and how we overcome fear is by increasing our faith, how do we learn to trust God more than we trust him even today? First of all, we need to focus our attention on God, or I must focus my attention on God. The psalmist begins with these words in verse 1. He says, "I lift up my eyes." This is a common Hebrew expression that it refers to more than just our physical eyes. It means that we are to notice something. It means to become aware of the possibilities that are around us. When I was in Louisiana, I began as a chaplain for a volunteer fire department, And I would go, when I had a radio and a pager, and when they'd get a call, I would go out and I would respond. And I always just sort of felt silly. I know I shouldn't, but I always sort of felt silly just sort of standing on the sidelines just praying for what was going on. I felt like I needed to be participating, so I went through class and learned my EMT basic, my national certification. But to be honest with you, I would never be a good EMT because I tend to have tunnel vision. I tend to focus on one thing and miss all the things that are around. And what happens in our lives oftentimes is that we are so focused on the things that are consuming us that we miss all the things that God is doing around us. We're so involved in the immediate. We're so involved in what is obvious that we miss the truths that God is at work in our lives all around us, that God is there. And so as we think about lifting up our eyes, if we were to lift up our eyes, we were to lift up our eyes to the Lord. And it's really, honestly, it expresses one of the greatest freedoms that we who are children of God have in our lives, and that is the freedom to decide where we're going to focus our minds. It really is a choice. We can choose that we're going to focus on the things that are causing the anxiety and the stress in our life, or we can choose to focus our attention on God. We can focus on our problems. We can focus on our fears. We can focus on our sense of weakness and our lack of control. Because our natural tendencies, we'll see in the next point, is that we like to be in control, right? We all are control freaks. We all want to talk about other people that have OCD and say that person there's a control freak. Just boil it all down. We all are control freaks. We all want to be in control. We want to be in control of our destiny. We want to be in control of our children. We want to be in control of our grandchildren. We want to be in control of our boss, our jobs. We want to be in control of every aspect of our lives, but the reality is we really have control of very little, right? We really don't have any control. I mean, we worry about, the mission team's going to go to Mexico or go to Africa, are things safe, and we worry about their safety, but the reality is we could be walking across the street right here, or walking through this parking lot, and someone could run right over us. Just like we saw yesterday at the Oklahoma State thing, where a drunk driver runs through the crowd and kills multiple people. They're standing there having a grand old time. They're in a place of safety. They're standing behind an officer on a motorcycle. Surely I am safe, and yet they were not. And so often we want to manipulate, we want to control every aspect of our lives, and the fact that we cannot, it causes us to be filled with fear and anxiety. Or we think, if I could just be more like this person or that person, that I could overcome my fears. And so we wish that we could control even our personality, but the reality is God created us for who we are, and we can never be that person. In all honesty, that person that we think that we wish we could be like, they struggle with the same fears that we have. They're just better at covering it up. They're just as afraid as you are. They're just as afraid as I am. They have the same insecurities that we have. They're just better at covering it than we are. And so we're all filled with fear, and we have the choice that we can focus on all these different things, or we can choose to focus on God. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, it's one of my favorite passages of Scripture. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." As we run through this race called life, there's all these distractions, there's all these things that cause fear and anxiety in our lives. And we are faced with the choice, am I going to focus my attention on the hardships and the struggles in my life? Am I going to focus my attention on the things that I fear? Or am I going to focus my attention upon the Lord? Because He alone is the perfecter and the author of my faith. He is the only one that I can really gain and grow faith from. It's as we focus our attention on Him. And so we're faced with a question this morning. What is it that we are focusing our lives on? Do we talk more about our problems than we talk about God? Do we talk more about the things that cause worry and fear in our lives, or do we talk more about God? Because the things that we talk about are the things that we truly are focused on. The things that we think about, the things that we are always talking about, those are the things that really are our focal point. And so we have a choice. Am I going to focus all of my attention on my problems? Or am I going to trust God to work in my life? Am I going to focus my attention on Him, and that He can give me the discernment, that He can get me through whatever it is that I'm facing in my life? Listen, what you focus on the most is what will control your life. If you want your life controlled by your fear and anxiety and your worry, then focus your attention there. If you want to experience the peace that only God can bring, then focus your attention upon the only one who can bring peace in the midst of the chaos. The second thing is we need to understand that God, not me, is in control. Or I guess I could say it this way, that we need to understand that God, not you, is in control. The psalmist asked the question at the end of verse 1. He says, from where does my help come? And then in verse 2, he gives us the answer. He says, my help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Our tendency when we encounter fear is to go into this control mode, which I mentioned earlier. We get into this mode where we want to try to control everything. We begin to trust in ourselves. We trust our strength. We trust in our gifts, our natural gifts, and also our spiritual gifts. We trust in our determination. If I just want to will myself through this, I can do it. We trust in our education. We trust in our finances. Some of us don't trust our finances. We trust in a little plastic thing that goes inside of our wallet that we can keep charging up until the bank says no more. And then some of us want to trust our network of friends. If I can just call all my friends, then I can make it through that. And friends are important. We need those things. Our spiritual gifts are important. But if that's what we go to try to manipulate or try to control the circumstances of our lives, those things will never be able to meet our needs. But look at what the psalmist says about our helper. It says that he made heaven and earth. What he says there is that the one who is our helper, the one who helps us in our time of need, that he is the author and the creator of all life. And not only is he the author and creator of life, but he also is the sustainer of all life. You want to know why the earth stays exactly where it stays in its orbit around the sun? Do you want to know why the moon stays exactly where it is? It's not because of some big bang or some accidental thing. It's because God is sustaining the earth until the end. God sustains the earth. I mean, we think about the natural disasters that have, or the man-made disasters that have happened. We think about the oil spills in the Gulf, or we think about, we can go on and on about all these things. And it's always miraculous how God has created the earth where a lot of those things begin to take care of themselves. Because God is in control. That this is his earth. That he is in control of our lives. That he's not directing us like puppets, but that he's actively involved in our lives. That as his children, that he protects us. That nothing comes into our life that he doesn't allow. And anything that he allows into our life, that he's going to give us the strength and the grace to make it through those things. And sometimes he delivers us out of the midst of those things. And most of the times he delivers us through the hardships, the struggles, the fears of life. And as our creator, God knows what is best for us. Listen, he knows every intimate detail of our lives. My baby brother texted me the other day and said, hey, do you know, and he named this girl. It was my girlfriend in high school. And I was like, how did my brother meet her? I mean, there's 14 years difference between us. I'm thinking, how did he meet that girl? And it's one of those things like the song, the country song that talks about thank God for unanswered prayers. That's one of those unanswered prayers. And of course, she may look at me and say the same thing. I don't know. But I think about that. God knows what is best for us. I don't necessarily believe that God has just one specific person in mind for us. But I do believe that God has a type of person for us. And then when we go along with that God directs and moves in our lives. And I may be wrong on that, and that's okay. But I couldn't have picked a better wife than the wife that I have. That she compliments me in all the areas of my weakness. That I'm sort of bullheaded and headstrong, and she's more laid back, which helps me because she would probably kill me because I want things my way. And so God takes care of those things. That God knows what's best for us. I don't know why I chased that big long rabbit, but God knows what is best for us better than we know what's best for ourselves. I look back over my life, even in ministry, when some of the things that I really wanted, that I prayed toward and I hoped for, and then when they didn't happen the way I thought they ought to happen, that I was discouraged and I was down and out. And then I look back through my life and I can see how God was working and moving in my lives. I can see some things in my life that I wanted God to rescue me out of. And I can go back and I can look now and I can see how in every one of those circumstances that God was using the circumstances of my life that were unpleasant, that some of them were unkind, and yet some of them even were of my own doing, and how God was using those things in my life to make me into the person that he wanted me to be. Early in my Christian walk, I was very judgmental and I was very legalistic. And as I began to evaluate and see my own failures and my own struggles, and I look back, then I really begin to see how God is working and molding me and bringing in me the gifts of compassion and love toward others. I'm not sure early days in ministry I always had that, but yet God has a way of shaping and molding and moving in our lives because he knows what is best for us. But not only does he know what is best for us, but he also has the power to help us in our times of trouble or our times of need. And the times that we need someone to step in and take care of us, God only knows what's best for us, but he has the power to make it happen. Listen, I can't manipulate it enough to make things turn out right. I may be able to manipulate things to make it turn out the way I want it to turn out, but I can't manipulate the way it needs to be. And yet God has a way to work and move in my life to make it exactly how it needs to be because he has the power to do it. That he is the God who spoke everything into existence. He is the one who breathed life into man. He is the one who took the rib out of Adam's side and made Eve. We go on and on and on about how God has worked around us and that he has the power. If God has the power to create the heavens and the earth, if God has the power to raise Jesus from the dead, does he not have the power to work the things out in our lives that we are struggling with and the things that we are afraid? And so we only will work it through our fears and our struggles as we begin to acknowledge that we're not in control, but he is. But listen, as our Creator, we also need to understand that he cares for us. That God cares intimately for us. In fact, he commands us at least twice that we are to cast our cares upon him because he cares for us. And so the fact that God cares for us, it ensures us that God has our best in mind and that he can be trusted. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, a verse that I think is important for many of us. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Listen, when we are afraid, let us not trust in ourselves, in our abilities, and our strengths, but instead let us put our trust in God, the only one who really can meet the greatest needs in our lives. The third thing as far as learning to trust God more is we need to remember that we need help and that we are not alone. That we need help and that we are not alone. In verse 3, the psalmist says, "He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber." We think about this word, keeps. That when we are afraid, we're told that we're to remember that God is our keeper. And the word that is translated keeps from Hebrew into English, it means to protect, to guard, to watch over, and to take care of. To watch really doesn't give a clear definition of what it really means. And I'm not even sure that keeps really totally explains the word and what it really means as far as how God is working in our lives. That God is there to not only to watch over us, not only to keep us, but he is there to protect us, to guard us, to watch over us, and to take care of us in our greatest times of need. And we're faced with fear. We need to remember that in the battle, that God will help us to stay on our feet. He says he keeps our feet from slipping out from underneath us. We think of that in the imagery of a battle, not in the kind of battle like we often do today where we got drones that we can fly. You can be in the U.S. and California somewhere and we can be flying over Afghanistan. But I'm talking about in the hand-to-hand battle that you would see in the first century and even the early part of our country, or even during World War II and World War I, that hand-to-hand combat. If you can't maintain your footing, then you're going to lose the individual battle. And the fact that God is the one who keeps our feet under us means that he gives us the strength and the stability to stand up under whatever he allows into our lives. That God is the one who keeps our feet under us. It's not by our strength. It's by his strength. It's not by our power. It's by his power that we are able to stand up. But not only does he help us to stay on our feet, but he also watches over us and he protects us. He watches over us and he protects us. To me, that's an amazing thought, to know that our Heavenly Father is actively watching over every one of us. That every one of us has great value to him. And that he loves us dearly. And that there's nothing that comes into our life that causes him to be surprised. That everything that comes, he knows. That he's there watching over us. And he is the one who's there protecting us and caring for us and really delivering us even to the very end. Listen, if we are honest, we would have to admit that there are times that we feel as though God is not going to show up. There are times that we feel that He's not going to be there. There are even times that we feel like He really doesn't care for us. And it's in those moments that we often run to our hiding places. It may not be like for me under the covers, or for some of you maybe up in a tree house, or some fort you built in the woods, or maybe some secret corner in the house where you can go and hide out. We want to run to our hiding place because there it seems like we're in control and we can hide from the problems of our lives. For us as adults, I know it may not be under the covers of the treehouse, but we all have our hiding places that we go to. For some of us, it may be in alcohol, or it may be in bad relationships. It could be all different kinds of things that we run to for our hiding place. And our hiding places tend to give us a temporary relief from our fears. But listen, God's purposes for our lives are not achieved when we are hiding in our fear. God's purposes in our lives are not brought about when we are hiding in fear, but instead God is calling for us to stand up and be the men and be the women that He has called us to be, to trust Him to help us work through those things. So we need to draw close to Him and allow Him to speak peace into our lives instead of going into our temporary places. I want to go back real quickly to John chapter 20. You would think that after Jesus had spoken into His disciples' lives and said, peace be with you, that bing, bang, boom, that they'd have peace and they would be standing strong and ready to charge the gates. But what we see in verse 26 of the same chapter, it says 8 days later, His disciples, Jesus' disciples, were inside again. Once again, they were in an upper room. And it says, and Thomas was with them. And notice what it says. It says, although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Listen, learning to trust God instead of running to our hiding places. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes time. It's a process of us learning to trust God. Now, in fact, what you will see, if you were to talk to anybody here who's been a believer for very long, what you will find is that our faith is increased every time that we take a step of faith and we see God being faithful. The next time we're faced with a big fear again, we take another step and we trust God even more. It's a process of learning to trust God more each day as we take one step at a time. It's sort of like life. When I first went into ministry, I really wanted God to give me this battle plan, that He would lay it all out and say, this is what I want you to do. But what I have discovered in my life is that most of the time it's one step at a time. And sometimes that step that I'm taking feels like I'm about to step off the side of a cliff. But then as I take that step, there was one honest person. As I took that step, then I began to realize that God was there all along. Each step of the way, I recognized that God is still there. But each step felt like I was stepping off the side of a cliff. There wasn't a clearly defined path, only one step at a time. And that's the same way that it is to learning to overcome our fear and to begin to grow in our faith, is that every day we learn to trust Him more. That every day is faced with a new battle, every day is faced with a new fear, every day is faced with a new worry. And with each one of those, again, we step out in faith, trusting and believing that God is going to work. Listen, every one of us needs courage. And the only real place we really find courage is not trying to work it up in ourselves and saying, today's the day I'm not going to be afraid. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to do what I need to do. But instead it's saying, God, you know how scared I am. And Lord, I really want to trust you. But unless you give me the strength, unless you give me the unction to step out, I just don't have it in myself. I need you. I need you desperately in every aspect of my life. And it also comes as we begin to know more and more about God, of who He is in our lives. Listen, I don't know what the fear is that you're facing right now. I don't know what the struggle that you're going through. Only God knows that. But what I'd like to do at the end of this service this morning is I'm going to ask Jordan if he'd just come and play, either guitar or piano, whatever you'd like to play. And I'd like for us, if there's a fear you're struggling with, if there's something, a worry that's just consuming every aspect of your life, I just want to open up this time for us to pray, for us just to seek His face, because He's the only one that can bring peace into the chaos. He's the only one that can bring structure into the disorder.